There's something beautiful about going into situations without any expectations. You free yourself from preconceptions, and you get to experience everything authentically. This is typically how I like to travel, and there's a certain magic about letting a place reveal itself to you, one day at a time. But usually, I know a thing or two about a place I'm going to, because I've already chosen to go there for a reason. This time is different, however, as Fujifilm has flown me out to the city of Prague for X Summit, and I know nothing about this place. On top of that, I'm doing something I've never done before. Be part of a trip for one of the biggest camera brands out there, with other like-minded creators who I've only just met, to test a new camera that very little people know about, myself included. This is the Fujifilm GFX100RF, Fujifilm's first ever fixed lens camera in the GFX series. So I've never personally owned a GFX system before, or used one extensively, but I have a lot of experience with the X100 series, specifically this one, the X100V. Seeing GFX100RF in person for the first time and holding it, it feels and looks very similar to that of an X100 camera. And if I'm being honest, if I didn't know that this camera existed, I would have thought it was an X100 series camera if I saw it on the street. It's pretty comparable in size, which is crazy to think because this camera has a 102 megapixel sensor. And even though the camera is slightly larger and a bit bulkier than an X100, it's not much heavier or less comfortable to hold. In fact, I feel like the taller body here actually improves the ergonomics a bit. The lens featured on the Fujifilm GFX100RF is a 35mm lens, which offers an equivalent view of a 28mm lens in full frame. Although because of the format of the sensor, I'd say the 28mm lens feels a little wider than that. You aren't limited to that 28mm lens though, because the camera offers a 4-level digital teleconverter that lets you switch to a 45, a 63, and 80mm full frame equivalent lenses, all from this switch on the front. That being said, these are just essentially cropping into the 28mm frame. It's not going to give you the actual perspective of those lenses. That kind of technology just doesn't exist yet. But it's nice that you have that option. Digital teleconverters like this aren't anything new, but it's the first time I've seen it implemented into the actual physical design of the camera. On top of that, the camera's 102 megapixel sensor means you're not sacrificing much image quality when you're using the digital focal lengths. If you shoot in the RAW file format, the full image is still preserved, but it'll automatically crop into the teleconversion mode that you were in. I'm mostly a 50mm lens user, so I've rarely used the camera at its 28mm mode, and have been using all 3 of the digital teleconversion modes. Because of that, I'm not really maximizing the full potential of this camera's sensor, which is something to consider if you're thinking about getting this camera. One of the things that has stood out to me about Prague is the combination of old and new. Most of the buildings here I've noticed still have that old architecture with that old charm to them. But sprinkled in between are these very modern, futuristic looking buildings. Kind of reminds me of London in that way. I will say though that these more modern buildings, they make for great abstract photos, and if you know anything about me, I love a good reflection photo. The GFX100RF has another unique dial on the back of it, and it lets you switch between different aspect ratios depending on how you like to compose your photos. Personally, I've been sticking to the 4:3 ratio since I see most compositions that way. However, I can see this aspect ratio dial being very valuable to photographers who have a specific look in mind and want to be able to compose and see through their camera just how they want to shoot. Something like this is usually hidden in a menu screen, but on the GFX100RF, it's again built physically into the design. One of the criticisms people have about the X100 series cameras is that it's an APS-C sensor, which honestly I don't think is a really fair criticism to begin with, but I do think this camera specifically is sort of an answer to those critics. It has all the appealing characteristics of an X100 camera, minus the optical viewfinder of course, but without the compromise of image quality, since this sensor is even bigger than full frame. Having 102 megapixels in a camera this small and compact, it's pretty wild if you ask me. As for autofocus, it's pretty respectable. It's not going to be the best autofocus out there, but for me, it does the job. So these are some of my very fresh first impressions of the GFX100RF. The camera itself is beautiful. It's everything you love about the aesthetics of an X100 camera, but it offers a whole lot more in terms of image quality because of the larger sensor. But it is a pretty niche camera, and it certainly stands out among the rest of Fujifilm's lineup. That being said, I don't think it's going to be a camera for everyone, but catered to a very specific group of enthusiast camera lovers. If you look at the market of cameras right now, there really isn't a digital rangefinder style camera offering 102 megapixels that is at this size and compactness. And that alone makes it stand out among the crowd, and I think that's its biggest selling point. So let me know your thoughts about the Fujifilm GFX100RF. I'm interested to hear what you think and to see if any of you here are potentially considering it for what you do. A big thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring today's video. I've been using Squarespace to run my own professional website for my photography for over 6 years. And it's the platform I run pretty much everything from my portfolio, my blog, newsletter, and digital store. And I've stuck with them so long because of how seamless it is to use. I just recently gave my website a refreshed look, and it was super easy to do all of that with Squarespace's design tools. So maybe this is your time to get started yourself with Squarespace. You can visit squarespace.com/Faisal and use the code Faisal to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain.